Hello and welcome to Schema Stories. My name is Martha Van Berkel and I'm the CEO at Schema App. And I am delighted today to be joined by Aaron Bradley. Welcome, Aaron.
Hey, how's it going, Martha?
Excellent. Well, not only am I excited because you're Canadian and we get to geek out on structured data together, above the 49th. But I'm also excited because you bring a really unique perspective in your role within the enterprise. And so maybe we'll just start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I often say I've had three careers. That inevitably led me to the place that I am. I was a technical services librarian for about a decade. Following that, I was a web designer for about a decade. And now for slightly more than a decade, I've been a search engine optimization specialist. Though like most SEOs, my role has enlarged and deviated. So to encompass other realms of digital marketing and particularly the creation and distribution of digital content across platforms. Right now, as I have been since around 2014, I work for Electronic Arts, where I'm a web channel strategy manager and have a great team that work on these issues alongside me.
Excellent. Tell me a bit how you got started, like within those kind of three careers. When did you first get started using Schema Markup or exploring structured data?
It was in around 2008 when I was working for a jewelry e-commerce site called ice.com. And I first encountered Martin Hepp's Good Relations ontology for e-commerce. I was very excited about it. I think maybe because of my librarian bent and having worked with controlled vocabularies in the past, I saw this as an interesting and exciting way of informing search engines and other data consumers about what products were about on a web page, and began kind of exploring it then. This is, of course, well before the release of schema.org. Back in those days, you had microformats were the main structured data type. I can't recall yet whether datavocabulary.org, which is a precursor to schema.org, had yet been released. So the search engines, and even though Good Relations was a well-developed ontology, the search engines weren't doing much with that or anything at all. But following on that, Jay Myers of Best Buy began marking up all of their product catalog in RDFA using Good Relations. So just ever since then, I've been kind of keeping my finger on the pulse of those developments that eventually led to schema.org and the birth of, well, rich snippets predated schema.org, I believe, started to roll out in 2009. And incrementally, we saw after that that rich snippets were being fueled increasingly by search engine sanctioned structured data.
Very cool. So for those that aren't semantic technologists that are listening, in kind of layman terms, like how would you describe an ontology?
An ontology describes the types of things that you can talk about and the relationships between them in a highly structured way. So, for example, an ontology might define a person like Aaron, and it might describe a relation. Aaron knows Martha Van Berkel, and those are all highly structured relationships and descriptions of classes, so that there's certain attributes associated with those. So it enables data consumers to have a very precise view of what you're talking about, and applications, since we're just talking ontologies more generally, and they're the building blocks then of taxonomies. Most notably, the Simple Knowledge Organization System, SKOS. It rests on various standards, including the RDFS, so that there's ontologies behind all of that. And schema.org is sort of a de facto ontology if people are arguing whether it's an ontology or content schema. But it is, like other ontologies, provides precise descriptions of things and the relationships between them. And then from that, in modern parlance, most ontologies are compatible with linked data. That is to say that they reside at URIs that are dereferenceable. That means both humans and machines can go and then look up information about that class or those relationships at that URI. That's something that people, I think, kind of don't necessarily understand, kind of more traditional SEOs about schema.org, that when you say person has name, or the name property Aaron, that person is schema.org/person, and name too is a relationship, schema.org/name, so that it creates a graph. And that's what, obviously the biggest example of that is the Google Knowledge Graph. I think the really big picture point that I love everyone to take away from this, and really what the introduction first of rich snippets and then later of the Google Knowledge Graph really introduced into the search engine world is, and as encapsulated by Google's famous marketing phrase for the knowledge graph, from strings to things, is that prior to this, search engines were essentially indexes of documents. So when you search for something, you really, if you were looking for blue widget, you really weren't getting results for things that were blue widgets. You were getting web pages that described or used the string, the text, blue widget. Awesome. Whereas now, and especially since the introduction of the Google Knowledge Graph, but also fueled by structured data, what we now have is a web of things, kind of one of Tim Berners-Lee's great visions for the web. So that rather than being an index of documents, Google is increasingly becoming an index of things and facts related to those things. And you can't possibly have that without those sort of linked data technologies working in the background, including ontologies, schemas, taxonomies, all of that sort of thing.
Love it. And so this sort of movement from strings to things, like in your role at EA, like how do you see this evolution like playing out in the enterprise, right? Which is maybe a bit different than how we often talk about this as like doing SEO for specifically for different companies or within agencies. Like how do you see that application within the enterprise, and how can they benefit?
Certainly it's a crucial and key component in personalization, and especially personalized content delivery. In order to deliver at scale personalized experiences, you need to know two things. You need to know something about your user, and you need to know something about your content. And the more modeled that is, the more rich you can make those experiences, and the better the relevance of the content that you can present to a user. Now, to give you an example, so we might know that, say, a user plays Battlefield 1, one of our games, and in our own systems, that's linked to a taxonomic term, which is the genre first-person shooter, described by an ontology, and other games then are described by that same structure. So therefore, we might say that Star Wars Battlefront 2 might be of interest to that player because they've expressed an interest, or we know that they play Battlefield 1, and therefore we might want to surface content in that very kind of plain example about Star Wars Battlefront 2 because it's also a first-person shooter. And you can infer that through having that structured universe. So if I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 article that I'd like to surface for a player, it's not necessary for me to label that, to tag that, and sort of typical content parlance first-person shooter. That can be inferred by making a query against, you say to the system, okay, I know that this player likes Battlefield 1. Show me all other games, content about all other games that are also of that genre. So as long as we know that piece of content is correctly associated with the game Star Wars Battlefront 2, we also know it's a first-person shooter. We also know it's playable on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 and PC. So there's all these attributes about games that then we can associate with content, and then we can provide that data to players. And that's a very high-level and very simple example, but I think you can see how that sort of inferencing can start to be really powerful in recommending content across the enterprise.
Absolutely. And I love how you sort of use the ask the question to the data, right? I think that's something that I've seen in other interviews with you is like sort of like start thinking about like, what would you ask Google Assistant? So in the enterprise, you're saying like, well, what kind of questions would you want to ask your data to start with to be able to answer that question? And often we sort of ask that question around like semantic analytics, like, what
Right.
question do you want to get from your analytics? And, can
Exactly.
you sort of use some of that structured information to gain that? Love it.
Yeah, and querying is really core to any sort of many of these processes, right? Whether you're querying your analytics or whether you're querying your content or whether you're querying user events, if they're described in the same ways, that starts to really present powerful possibilities of joining one with the other. And when you're dealing with data, you always have to think of it from a machine data consumer perspective, right? So you're not going to be able to get answers to questions that your data isn't aware of, right? So it has to be structured in such a way that it supports those queries. And in building a lot of the systems that I've worked on, that's really where a lot of the MVP, minimum viable product requirements start with. It's can it satisfy this query and this query and this query? And if not, then you modify your architecture in order to satisfy that.
Which is a good lead into the next question around, so I work in an enterprise. I can, for me, I put on my hat from my Cisco days to say,
Right.
how do I get started doing this, right? If I want to move in this direction, while also sort of thinking about the search applications, what would you recommend to people sort of sitting in an enterprise who want to move in this direction? What would be like a first step to help them get started or to get thinking about this?
Excellent questions to which I don't necessarily have a ready answer. I think, familiarizing yourself and starting to use schema.org is a good lightweight way of starting to be introduced to these technologies. I would actually go the extra mile. I'm just such a big linked data guy. I think of promise, and I think to truly understand something like schema.org, you do need to know a little bit about linked data and how it works. At one time what we would call the semantic web, but linked data is now more the term. There's a couple of canonical documents about that. If you anyone watching this, go ahead and Google Tim Berners-Lee's work. I forget the year, but it's called Linked Data Design Issues, in which he provides the 5 rules of linked data. If you understand those 43 words, you'll really understand linked data and the semantic web.
I'll pull that into the interview notes too, so people can just refer there.
And Manu Sporny, who's actually one of the pioneers, along with Greg Kellogg and Nicholas Lanthaler of JSON-LD, has an excellent series of YouTube videos on various introduction to the semantic web, JSON-LD, things like that. So that's where I'd start in terms of knowledge, and then I'd go ahead and put this into practice by starting to apply schema.org schemas to existing content, at least if you're in a web environment, and seeing how that's structured and what the outputs are and what the results are.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm a big believer in like start with some of the standards and then extend, because you can move a lot faster, right? I understand sort of getting started from the technicals perspective, right? So we'll sort of include a lot of those resources. You obviously have great executive sponsorship in the work that you're doing, since you've been doing this, since 2014 and sort of getting really deep into it. How do you translate this into like the business value? Like, how do you tell that story? You talked a bit about personalization. Anything else with regards to sort of the business outcomes that get the executives excited about investing in this?
Sure. I mean, obviously, you need to point to, in any sort of digital marketing efforts, you do need to point to business value. And I think that there's a number of ways of doing that. And I'll give 3 examples. One, obviously, from a search perspective, if you start using structured data markup, you will start to see rich results surfacing in the search engines, and you will absolutely and unequivocally see a rise in engagement and CTR from those results, because they're information is provided to the users directly in the SERP about that, they tend to have higher click-through rates. You're providing the search engines with really explicit information about the things on the page that are represented there, so you're more likely to show up in query results for relevant queries, and this should all, at the end of the day, translate into a better bottom line, particularly if you're looking at the typical and correctly so web metrics of conversion rate optimization and revenue. You touched a little bit ago on and extending that. Another example is analytics, and I think still one of the underutilized promises of schema.org is using it to tie in, whether it's Google Analytics or another platform, so that you can start to slice and dice that data as well by the things that are represented in the content rather than by the strings that identify it. For those that work in Google Analytics, at the end of the day, Google content groupings are rather blunt instruments. But if you're already marking up your content, particularly if you're using JSON-LD, then you have at your fingertips the capability of then exposing that information within your analytics and being able to make some really interesting and useful queries against that data to then extract business value. And then finally, if you're looking this, at a truly enterprise scale, if you're a large company with whether it's a single domain that's highly focused or an e-commerce site, if you start to build linked data applications, you can start to use these same technologies to bootstrap your efforts, particularly. And that's what we've done at EA as we built out our initial ontology for games, is that we use schema.org to bootstrap that. It's a very useful all-purpose sort of vocabulary that you can then locally extend, but it tends to cover kind of most use cases that are most common in across businesses. So to recap then, start with the fundamentals. If you're a web shop of search engine optimization, start looking into the possibility of bringing that data into your analytics and start to think about, pie in the sky, what if I could connect all of the data points across the enterprise in some sort of semblance of order? What sort of value could I get from that? And I think properly framed, you get executive support and buy-in from that, and particularly if you follow those incremental steps, because you're going to show literal business value by those first couple of steps. It will lead to an increase in conversion and revenue.
Love it. Two more questions and then we'll wrap up today. How do you, who do you follow or what do you watch in order to stay on top of the trends, like in this space, especially around the enterprise?
Yeah, in the schema realm, I follow the schema.org mailing list, but more importantly these days is the schema.org GitHub repository. That's where most of the development work and discussions around it takes place. And it's great because you get to work with the people that actually build the vocabularies and work in them. Aside from that, it's a broad spectrum of people. I actually have I forget how many members it has. It must be close to 1,000. I have a Twitter list that's open. You can add that to the notes, called Semantic Web, where kind of everyone that I've ever been able to find that works on linked data is there. I also, go to conferences. I've been to the last couple of taxonomy boot camps in London. I spoke at Semantics 2017, and for those that maybe aren't that heavily into those sort of more extreme applications of linked data, the search people. Obviously, I'll promote my own community group that I moderate along with my friend and colleague Arno van Driel, Semantic Search Marketing, bit.ly SemSearch, which is a great starting point. Particularly if I have any questions about structured data markup. We're a very active and responsive community
I love the debates in that community.
Yeah.
I think you joke that I come in always with the business questions or applications, but you can ask really technical questions. You can ask business relevant questions. You can be a beginner or advanced, and you guys are so welcoming to people to ask those questions. Yeah, we'll make sure people are really clear on how they can join that and look at that. So my last question is, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about schema.org, what would that thing be?
Yeah. Hard to say because it's not especially lacking. I should point out too that schema.org really benefits from the experience of a lot of people that worked on the project from the early days and have been involved with it. Most importantly, Dan Berkel, who, along with Levy Miller, developed the first really broad scale web ontology, which was FOF, friend of a friend vocabulary for describing people and the relationships between them. It's really, really solid stuff, and you have lots of luminaries of that space, like Martin Hepp and Kingsley Iden, who are involved in that space. So it's quite solid. I think if I could do one thing, I would vastly extend the number of examples and the clarity on schema.org. There's probably, for many practitioners, too many pages where there are no examples, or too many pages where the examples are immediately get a little esoteric when it should be, start with a straightforward display of information about that particular type and get more esoteric after that. So I think it has the potential to confuse some kind of novice webmasters there. But in terms of the vocabulary itself, I don't see any major holes, and as those are identified, they are being filled. So.
Awesome. Yeah, we try to help our customers with those examples, or like changing the definitions so you can actually understand, if you're not a semantic technologist, what it means. Well, thank you so much for your time today. If people want to find you, where can they find you online?
Oh, I'm everywhere. So Twitter is the easiest, twitter.com, arrange 2 A's rather than 2 R's. I don't blog enough, but I do blog sometimes. But my blog, SEO Skeptic, and as I said, semantic search marketing, the community I run with Yarno on Google Plus. Yes, I know somebody uses Google Plus. Anyways, it's a good.
We use it for that search community, if nothing else. Yeah, well, I hear you're a schema ninja today. Maybe you can give us a flash of your T-shirt just for fun.
Schema ninja.
With awesome Jason LD on the back, describing how you are indeed a ninja. Thank you again, Aaron, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Martha. You too.